Good night, everybody. Tonight's story is called The Wake and it's written by Patricia Carr from Fanad in County Donegal. I murmured a quiet rosary and reflected that this might well be the only religious aspect of this young lad's Irish burial. There were no tombstones on the sea and no markings in Calvary, the makeshift graveyard in which washed-in bodies were interred. The tranquility of the setting was in stark contrast to my reason for being there. I tried to put the unpleasant aspect of the night to the back of my mind. My heart bled for his family, their fine son taken in this crazy conflict, his body washed up so far from home. This could be my own uncle, killed and buried in Burma, unknown to those who dug his grave. I gently lifted the sheet covering his face. I touched his joined hands. They felt clammy and cold. I wasn't afraid. He looked like a gentle soul, and tales of ghosts and ghouls never bothered me anyway. It was going to be a long night. I decided to take a break and left the hut for a while. The wind, like the croak of an old raven, at first caressed the moonlit Atlantic swell. A growing storm rose around my eardrums. It whipped the calm sea into a frenzy. Every seventh wave smashed itself to pieces against the rocks and cast its arms skywards. The thunder of the white horses' hooves could be heard across the bay. They were at full gallop, driven by the northern storm. I rolled my uniform trench coat tightly around me and stood a while to watch this unfolding drama. A freak wave propelled itself onto the promontory on which I stood. I gasped and swallowed a mouthful of the effervescent froth as I staggered into the path of the blinding spray. The briny taste soldered itself to the roof of my mouth. A second wave threw itself over me and thundered into the air. A feeling of disorientation gripped me, and I realized that I should get back to shelter. Dripping wet, I hastened to the safety and comparative comfort of the ramshackle hut. The winds buffeted the door that hung loosely on its hinges, but I managed to secure it without too much difficulty. I combed my hair with the wind of my hand, threw aside my soaking trench coat and sat down. I clapped my hands and rubbed them together in an effort to restore the lost feeling. The echo of this simple task startled me in the heart-pounding audible silence. Stretching myself on the makeshift settle bed, I felt the swirl of the gale as it lulled me into an uneasy sleep. When I awoke, it took me a minute to figure out where I was. What was that constant nagging, dripping sound? In the hazy, semi-darkness, I realized that was the water running off my oilskins onto the frigid slate of the floor. The steaming stench of my other clothes, like that of unwashed corduroy and wet wool drying out, lodged in the back of my throat. In spite of having been lit for hours, the Stanley 8 range was still radiating warmth, and my first thoughts was to keep it stoked up. A puff of smoke ghosted out as I opened the fall door to increase the draught. The heathery sods sparkled and sizzled as their sparks were drawn up the chimney and into the night sky. Soon the old black kettle was puffing steam. The heat reached out for me. Its gurgling lent a slight homely air to this dark and dismal setting. The tea was bitter and had a slight taste of mould. In the stillness I could hear every mouthful as I slowly swallowed. Having put the cup back on the rickety shelf, my thoughts turned once again to my lifeless charge. The match rasped as I struck it off the bottom of my toe-plated shoe. The candle light flickered sideways in the draught, almost dying out only to flare up again with renewed luminance. It cast an eerie sloping light over the corpse. Little patchy hillocks of shadow emphasized the general shape of the body underneath. Death permeated my senses. The sight of this lifeless bundle, the lingering, mouldering scent in my nostrils which dripped into my throat, the covering sheet rigid and icy to touch and almost bizarre of all, and most bizarre of all, the haunting noise of the throat rattle as excess air was being expelled. He was somebody's son, and this was his wake. I murmured a quiet rosary and reflected that this might well be the only religious aspect of this young lad's Irish burial. There were no tombstones on the sea and no markings in Calvary. The makeshift graveyard in which washed-in bodies were interred. I blessed myself as I finished my recitation. It was then I realised that the wind was lisping gently through the cracks in the door. In the hope that the storm had passed, I took a furtive look through the grime-smudged window. On my second venture out, the scene was transformed. As if guided by the touch of an almighty hand, calm had descended. The air had salt and the sweetness of seaweed on its breath. Rooted to the spot, I watched the spine-tingling sight of the round pale moon as it rolled into view from behind Murrin Hill. At first it looked like a giant tilly mantle, too delicate to touch. Its growing light slotted into a dip behind the hill, making it resemble, for a moment, a giant origami. In next to no time, the moon was out over the sea, leaving a trail of golden light on the water. The breeze played a tune on my ribs, a cold melody, but one that was deliciously invigorating. The Atlantic swell had been transformed from frightening to serene with the rise and fall of the winds and tides. The potential power of these two natural elements taunted and thrilled my soul in equal measure. The musical rhythm of the waves was like a voice on my shoulder. It whispered, "Remember me." I was transported back to my granny's knee, smelling the salt-laden air and inhaling the wonder of my surroundings. The tale she told me as a child sounded credible now. God created Ireland, and his job was nearing an end. He found that he had an assortment of scraps left over. Waste was one thing that above all else he detested. "Let me see," he mused. "I could use these to fill the gap between Melmore and Malin." God's ragbag was upended, and it spilled forth gems, the like of which had not been seen before. After his Sunday rest, God set about putting these in order. The result was a rich mosaic of sea and sky, hill and glen, deep water lochs, wildflower wetlands and towering trees. He called this peninsula Fanad and placed it as the second highest point in the country. The intermittent gleam of the lighthouse, man's contribution towards the magic of Fanad Head, cut across my childhood musings. Its swathe of light complemented the fading moon as it illuminated the darkening stretch of sea. I shielded my eyes as its brilliance swept landwards towards me before it faded in the huge globe. In the shadow of the darkness, I could just make out the answering flashes of Tory Island and Horn Head lighthouses towards the west. Malin Head's flare was ghosted against the horizon. Nearer hand, Dunree Head, reflected in the lake of shadows. The Swilly completed this symphony of sea headlands and wordless beamed messages. This was the darkest time, that brutal hour just before dawn. I gazed over the rim of the cliffs towards the sea. This sea, which had yielded up its dead in raging spates, was now tranquil, gently reshaping the sleeping shingle as it ebbed and flowed. Was this symbolic of things to come? Would the hatred of these brutal times be consumed in waves of reconciliation? Would that I was able to beam a message to the unknown mother, sister, or wife of the lifeless young man unceremoniously waked in a tumble-down outhouse. I would tell them that he had been recovered and buried in Calvary, hopefully one of the last, as we consign this ramshackle resting place and this terrible war to the annals of history. Good night, everybody, and stay safe.